Now let's turn from foreign policy and military conflict to Cold War events in domestic society. And in particular, we're going to look at the events that would affect Asian Americans during this time. Now, as indicated in the slide here, a major change that occurs during the Cold War period will indeed be change in citizenship and immigration laws. And to be more specific, the elimination of race-based categories from naturalization laws and immigration laws. And as you now know, there has been a series of anti-Chinese legislation and anti-Japanese legislation that we examined in the past. Of course, there's the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. If you recall, that's the first and only immigration act that specifically designates a particular racial group. Attached to that was the aliens ineligible for citizenship clause that was, or actually provision that was inserted in that law, which basically barred Chinese from naturalization and citizenship. And it went on to bar, of course, Asians, to use the word back then, Orientals. So it applied to the Japanese, of course. Speaking of the Japanese, let's recall the Gentleman's Agreement, which barred Japanese labor immigration specifically. And following that, you'd have the 1913 Land Act, as well as the 1920 Land Act, again, aimed towards Japanese. And the culmination of all this would be the 1924 Immigration Act, otherwise known as the Johnson-Reed Act. Now, let's remember that's not aimed only towards Asians. It also set its sights on European immigration from the southern and eastern parts of Europe. But when it came to Asians, they were entirely excluded, with one exception, right? Filipinos. Why? Because they were a colony, unincorporated territory, to use a term. So Filipinos could migrate freely to the U.S. That's the only exception to the 1924 Immigration Act. Okay, and speaking of Filipinos, let's not forget the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which barred Filipino labor migration. So the result of all this anti-Asian legislation, especially immigration laws, right? It would result in a very small number of Asian Americans in the United States. At the time we're speaking of right now, post-World War II, it's only 0.2% of the entire population back then. By the way, today, Asian American population has climbed to almost 7%. Okay, and certainly we'll reach that by the next census period. But starting with the Cold War years, we would witness a considerable climb, considerable increase in Asian American immigration compared to those pre-Cold War numbers that I just referred to. And of course, this is going to be due to changes in immigration law at the time. Now, actually, the repeal of these race-based laws that led to Asian exclusion began during World War II. Okay, as seen here on this graph, the Magnuson Act was passed in 1943. And if you know anything about World War II, well, and as we discussed, actually, China was an ally of the United States, and it looked really bad that in our immigration laws, we banned Chinese. With the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So therefore, there was this felt need to repeal the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And of course, that resulted in the Magnuson Act here. Okay, so that's the first step probably in eliminating these anti-Asian laws. And that would be followed by the passage of the War Brides Act. And there'll be several of these laws, okay? So as you can see with the term war brides, what's happening here is during World War II, many GIs, many American soldiers, are actually marrying women abroad, okay? And not just in Europe, but a large number of Americans are marrying Asian women, okay? But when it came to Asian women, and even Europeans back then, certain Europeans, there were laws that prevented them from um, immigrating to the United States. So the government had to act in view of the fact that, these marriages were happening abroad. They knew they had to allow them into the country. After all, these were veterans of this war. So indeed, what happens is the said War Bride Act here in 1945, which allowed non-quota immigration of American military spouses and their children from overseas. Now, when it came to Asians, they finally passed another version in 1946, which allowed Chinese spouses specifically. And then the following year, 1947, all other Asian spouses. That, of course, that would include Japanese, Korean, Filipinos, and others. Okay, so that happens during World War II. Now we move forward to the Cold War years, and the first significant immigration act here is the McCarran-Walter Act. And, well, this is an interesting law, okay? Why? Because it's, for the most part, considered a conservative law, but it included more liberal provisions that were added to it during the congressional debates surrounding the law. Well, for one thing, the McCarran-Walter Act still enforced a quota of 2% of total immigration number upon Asian countries. The only exception to that would be the Philippines, okay? But all other Asian countries, well, they made sure to enforce this quota upon Asian countries and therefore Asian immigrants, right? Moreover, another quote unquote conservative element was that the national origins quota remained in effect. It was not repealed, okay? And we know what the national origins quota is, what set the quota upon all nations in the world that had a history of immigration to the United States. And of course, it corresponded to race because the higher amount of quotas or the higher immigration numbers were set for those countries that had white populations rather than darker skinned populations. Okay. So that remained in the law book still, the immigration laws. But one thing it did repeal was aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? That provision that, as we just mentioned, was incorporated with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and basically meant that all Asian immigrants could never pursue naturalization and therefore become a citizen. Now, let's remember with Wong Kim Ark, the decision with that Supreme Court case meant that all Asians born on U.S. soil, meaning the second generation, like the Nisei Japanese, well, they are automatically conferred with birthright citizenship, okay? But it also means that the immigrants, the first generation, still cannot enjoy citizenship rights. Okay, so what's being repealed here is exactly that, right? Aliens ineligible for citizenship, which means that now immigrants from Asia could actually pursue naturalization and become citizens. So when you think in a Japanese context in particular, why the Japanese? Because during this time, among the Asian groups, they have the largest immigration numbers, especially in terms of, families. And that's why you have the distinction between Issei and Nisei. So now, in that context, the Issei, the first generation Japanese, the immigrants, could now be naturalized into citizenship. So that's the part of the law, the McCarran-Walter Act, that is a corrective to the older race-based elements that were found in the immigration laws, pointedly directed towards Asians. Now, the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, well, it was felt by many that not enough was being done. And this is especially due to Soviet propaganda which was accusing the United States as being racist, and there's nothing we could do about that. I mean, it's explicit, right? We have Jim Crow, de jure legal segregation, as well as racist laws in the law books. And therefore, it'd be hard to attract those third world nations, comprised of darker skinned people, by the way, to enter the orbit of the first world. And U.S. policymakers were fully aware of this dilemma. Okay, so even with the McCarran-Walter Act, you see mounting criticism leveled at that law, especially due to the fact that the national origins clause was still in the books. It was still the law of the land. So you see efforts made to reform even the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, as seen with the successive presidencies, the Eisenhower administration, moving to the 60s with the Kennedy, and finally with the Johnson administration. Okay, they were particularly criticizing the National Origins Act, the National Origins Quota, as blatantly discriminatory against the third world. And just to repeat myself, we were trying to win the hearts and minds of third world people. So this looked bad, right? So therefore, the felt need to repeal this law. Now, I just mentioned Kennedy. John F. Kennedy would be elected as president in 1960, and he's immensely popular. And by the way, he happens to be the first Irish American elected into the presidency. Before this time, well, let's just say that many of the Anglos in the United States pretty much hated the Irish. Okay, there's this deep enmity between the two racial groups, extending back, okay, with the first Irish immigrants coming over to the United States. But here's, John F. Kennedy with an immigrant background in his family. He's pro-immigrant, pro-immigration. He wrote a book called The Nation of Immigrants, just to remind the United States that, hey, we're all immigrants. And he has the intent on overhauling the 1952 law, okay? And this would lead to eventually the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. Kennedy would be assassinated in 1963, but his successor, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, would basically carry the baton that was started by Kennedy in terms of immigration rehaul.